Hey everybody, HomeSliceHenry here, and today's video was aiming to answer one question. Why is Leaderboard's elo absolutely overrun with Kyurem White? This has been a massive meta trend with Kyurem White usage surging, and today I'm going to be trying out Kyurem White for the first time in ages to try and figure out why. Today's team features Kyogre lead, Kyurem White as the safe switch, and Xerneas as the closer, and I ended up going on a crazy 11-in-1 run to climb up to 3150 elo. Now, for whatever reason, during today's battles, there were a bunch of random trees in the background during the games. I have no idea why that is. Hopefully they get that fixed. But regardless, let's hop into game number 1. We pick up a very strong lead Kyogre into Zacian. My opponent is going to respond with Lunala safe switch, and I can send in Kyurem White. Kyurem White does have to fear super effective damage from Moonblast, but even down energy, Kyurem White is just so incredibly oppressive. The Dragon Breaths add up. I'm going to build up and full send the Ice Burn to guarantee the knockout or get my shield right back. My opponent will put up the shield. I do get the Ice Burn defense drop, which is quite nice. And now, as they fire off Moonblast number 2, I can look to build up to the back-to-back Fusion Flares. This means my opponent can now not really ever afford to put up a shield, because if they do, they're just getting outpaced, so they're going to let Lunala go, and instead bring back into Zacian. But this is part of what makes Kyurem White so deadly. Kyurem White has insane coverage. Ice plus fire coverage hits basically everything for monster damage. Zacian tries for the farm down, and they're unable to get there. And not only was I able to basically knock out 2 Mons, but I was able to get both shields down as well. In comes Kyogre, they're going to fire off a close combat, and I just need Xerneas to win the 1v1 versus whatever they have in the back. My opponent has a Dragon Tail Kyurem Black, and this game is over. Kyurem Black, unfortunately, regardless of fast move, I don't think is the strongest right now. Freeze Shock does still hit for some pretty big damage, but I can farm up till just shy of the back-to-back close combats, safe with the knowledge that I am outside of 2 Metal Claw range. Even at -2 defense, Xerneas holds on, and we're going to get the game number 1 win, as close combat is easily going to be knocking out the low HP Zacian. We move to game number 2, picking up another very nice lead as Kyogre leads into Xerneas. Kyogre's ability to beat the fairy types neutrally is a very big plus for putting this Pokemon on your team. My opponent safe switches into Lunala, and this time I decide to stay on the field with the Kyogre. I fire off Origin Pulse, they sniff out the full send, and that's going to make life quite uncomfortable. They have farmed up a massive amount of energy here, but I know that Kyogre is not going to get knocked out by a Shadow Ball. Instead, I should barely be able to hang on and make an Avalanche. While Avalanche will not take the knockout, it's going to be putting Lunala very low, and this can set up an energy advantage for my Kyurem White. Kyurem White is not a big fan of Xerneas, but because Kyurem White hits so incredibly hard, an Ice Burn would still absolutely pressure away a shield. So my opponent is going to be sending back in Xerneas now that Kyogre has been cleared from the field. I can overfarm massively, and I'm just full sending the nuke. I'm going for the Ice Burn. Ice Burn would just about take the knockout. They put up the shield. I pivot into my own Xerneas. My opponent banks back-to-back close combats and then sends in Kyogre. Kyogre will take some pretty big damage from Moonblast, and after the Moonblast, I can now build up and try and threaten a close combat. Close combat would take the knockout, my opponent's forced to fire off energy, and this is going to set up Kyurem White to win the game. As Origin Pulse wastes all their energy, in comes Kyurem White. We're going to get the full farm down and exit with a ton of energy. My opponent has the back-to-back close combats. If they ever close combat, then my Ice Burn knocks out. They're forced into Moonblasting so they don't debuff themselves, but in doing so, I can just double up on Fusion Flares and win the game. The pacing, the damage, and the speed on Kyurem White are just absolutely terrifying. Back-to-back Fusion Flares, knocks out the Xerneas, and so far, it really feels like Kyurem White doesn't have any real counters. We move to game number 3, and what do you know, we see a third Lunala. Lunala definitely feels like one of the best Pokemon that you can currently put on a Master League team, but my opponent does make a misplay here. They fire off the Shadow Ball as soon as they get it. Shadow Ball doesn't threaten a knockout, so I can very easily no shield, fire off the Origin Pulse to get shield advantage, and then since they don't have a lot of residual energy, I can send in Kyurem White. My opponent responds with a Reshiram, but this is another one of the reasons why Kyurem White is becoming so popular. Kyurem White absolutely destroys the other dragons. Kyurem White has a bigger HP stat than Reshiram and Zekrom, which means in head-to-head matchups, Reshiram and Zekrom both just kind of get absolutely destroyed. I mean, look at the difference. I had already taken some damage from Lunala before they switched in, and I can just fully farm them down and exit with so much energy. My opponent makes an insane peekaboo play as they catch the Ice Burn onto Zamazenta after initially sending in that Lunala. I'm going to bring in Kyogre. My opponent tries for the farm down, but they don't get it. I'm barely able to hang on, make the Origin Pulse, and Origin Pulse will take the KO. In comes Lunala. Lunala does have a decent energy head start, but they need a double up to win the game. And even if they do, I'm pretty close to a move on Kyurem White. Opponent sees the writing on the wall and concedes the match. We move to the next game and get a perfect mirror lead Kyogre into Kyogre. At this point, it's pretty well established that Kyogre should be on Origin Pulse plus Avalanche. If my opponent has a Surprise Thunder, that would be pretty terrible, but overall, Kyogre typically prefers the Origin Avalanche moveset because it gives it really good coverage, but also very strong neutral matchups. The Kyogres will trade Origin Pulses, and I intentionally decide not to throw my Avalanche. I would rather lose the lead and get a huge farm down on Kyurem White. So, I bring in Kyurem White, my opponent pivots into Eternatus, I'm going to bank energy and then send in my Xerneas. I'm trusting in the fact that having that big of an energy head start on Kyurem White should be strong into whatever my opponent could possibly have in the back, and I've Dragon Breathed them into Moonblast range. I farm up, and this is when I learned that I don't know Eternatus counts, and I play to a CMP tie that I do not win. That's a pretty big error, as that's going to cost me a shield, but at the very least, I will be able to remove Eternatus from the field of play, and when they bring in Kyogre, I can try and go for a snipe. So I bank a Moonblast, send in Kyurem, they're barely able to hang on, and they send in their final Pokemon as their own Xerneas. I build up past the Ice Burn, bait with a Fusion Flare, but that's a stone cold bait call from my opponent. They can now force my final shield, but with the amount of energy that I already have stored on the Kyurem, I feel like I'm in a pretty good spot. I'm very close to 2 more Fusion Flares, and I have a Charge Stack loaded on my Xerneas. So I get the first shield, this will get the second, and now my opponent has to try and make the read. Will I go for the combo play? I decide to stay in, they read the combo play, and this game is over. They bring in the Xerneas, firing off energy, again trying to predict the combo play, but I just stay on the field. Now I can bring in my Xerneas, fire off the Moonblast. Moonblast is going to be taking the knockout, so even with my opponent having a Xerneas for my Kyurem White up energy just simply does not care. Now there's a very scary sight on the lead in the next match as I lead Kyogre into my opponent's Kyurem White. Now, Kyurem White is completely walled by Kyogre, but I don't know if anyone told Kyurem White that. This resisted Ice Burn is going to hit for insane damage, and I bank an Origin Pulse and then switch into the mirror. I'm not quite sure how to play out of Kyurem White lead, but I think this is a pretty good way to do so. Bank the Origin Pulse for later, shield the Flare, and now when my opponent sends in Palkia, I can farm up a ton of energy and full send the Ice Burn. This will guarantee big damage onto the Palkia. My opponent puts up the shield, I try and make another Ice Burn, but my opponent's not going to let me get there, and from this range, even an Aqua Tail would be able to take the knockout. But this will set up Xerneas. Unfortunately, I do get the one turn to bring in there, so I don't sneak through the Geomancy that I was supposed to get. If there's any consolation, my opponent was always going to make this second Aqua Tail, as the Geomancy that snuck will not take the KO. So I'm pretty low on the Xerneas, but the good news for me is I have a ton of energy. The bad news is that it's Zacian in the back. I fire off the close combat, I'm going to need to pivot out and watch for the switch. My opponent sends in Kyurem, but I have so much energy loaded on Kyogre. I fire off the Avalanche. Avalanche will be shielded. Kyurem looking for a farm down, but they're not going to get there. This is going to be very close. Can I land a Waterfall on the Zacian? That could be the difference between winning and losing. The Waterfall lands, back in comes the Xerneas. I throw as many Geomancies as possible, but in this moment I know I'm going to fall just short. Close combat lands, Zacian survives on 1 HP, and that was the only loss that I had with this team. Hopping into the next match, we see a very familiar lead, Kyogre into Xerneas. And the Xerneas is staying in, which works out really nicely for me. I usually like to wait for them to throw energy, and then I can end up turn waiting before firing off my move because you do not want your Origin Pulse to be caught onto a Dragon type. So I overfarm, I wait the turn, and this guarantees that Origin Pulse is shielded or just taking the knockout. They put up the shield. If I get the Avalanche, I'm going for it, but my opponent will fire off energy, and I'm very okay with this. Kyogre got a shield advantage and a ton of damage, and now I can send in Kyurem. My opponent pivots into Landorus. Landorus is going to make the Stone Edge on the Charge Attack priority tie to my Ice Burn. I decide to go for the Fusion Flare bait. They put up the shield, and this is a tough call. Will they bait? Will they full send? I call the bait, and it's the Sandsear Storm. That could have been absolutely catastrophic if I no-shielded a Stone Edge, but by getting the bait call right, knowing that Landorus players love to go for those baits, now I should be in a pretty good position. I can overfarm quite extensively. I'm at -2 attack, so I will guarantee the knockout with the double super effective Ice Burn. And I still just have a Kyurem that's up energy. In comes Xerneas. I get the catch and sneak onto my own Xerneas. And at this point, it doesn't really matter what they have in the back. That should end the game. My opponent is very heavily debuffed. They pivot out. They have Groudon in the back. Here, I do make a bit of a misplay. I should have just gone double close combat into the Groudon instead of going for the Moonblast. I hadn't played against the Groudon in a bit with Xerneas. Groudon is very, very strong this season, but I would say it's underused, so I'm not too familiar with the damage ranges. In hindsight, double close combat probably could have taken the win there, but because I had a shield to spare, I should still be in a very good spot. My opponent brings back into Xerneas, I make the close combat, and that is going to seal it. I did have a bunch of energy on Kyurem White as well, and Kyurem White just keeps completely taking over games. This Pokemon is just absolutely absurd. We move to the next match, and we see a very familiar lead Kyogre into Lunala. As the Kyogre player, I would always prefer if Lunala threw on 7, because that gives me a pretty easy attempt to get shield advantage, and then I can pivot out into my Kyurem White. But Lunala's an overfarm genuinely make the game a lot more difficult. I do Avalanche bait, my opponent ends up throwing on very poor charge attack timing, so that's actually going to give me several free turns. Shadow Ball lands, I fire off the Avalanche, they get a catch onto Palkia, but this is still very valuable damage. After landing that, I can now bring in Xerneas and go for an incredibly aggressive Geomancy down. Xerneas never has to worry about Palkia unless Palkia gets to a third Aqua Tail, and with the damage they've already taken, they're just not going to get there. So I'm going to exit with a ton of Xerneas energy, and the fact that Ho-Oh isn't really a playable Pokemon with how strong the dragons are, it means that this energy is always going to be good. In comes Lunala, I fire off the Moonblast on the CMP tie because this energy is just simply too valuable to be lost. If the Moonblast lands, I'm hopeful that I will be able to get a Geomancy down. My opponent pivots, and they have Zekrom in the back, and this game is over. One of the reasons that Zekrom usage is trending a little bit down is because Zekrom gets absolutely destroyed by Kyurem White. Look at the Dragon Breath difference in this matchup, my goodness. The extra HP on Kyurem White is so incredibly noticeable. My opponent sees the writing on the wall and concedes the match. Speak of the devil, and it appears we lead Kyogre into Zekrom, and I'm going to instantly pivot out and send in Kyurem White. My opponent doesn't farm up to an outrage. This can only be a crunch, and crunch is not really something that I'm too worried about. In comes Reshiram. I'm only going to make it to 1 charge stack, so I will fire off the Ice Burn. Ice Burn will guarantee a shield from anything in a neutral matchup. Reshiram exits with a lot of energy, but I'm hopeful in the fact that they're probably on Crunch. Crunch really doesn't do a whole lot of damage onto Kyogre, so I'm very happy to no shield, but the moment they get a Crunch debuff, suddenly that's where the path becomes a little less clear. They go for Crunch number 2, they get a second debuff, I bank energy, and in the back, my opponent has their own Kyogre. Good news is I'm up a turn, so I can fire off this Moonblast and deny my opponent's ability to sneak. The Moonblast lands, I do get a Moonblast debuff, which is a stroke of good luck for me, but realistically, I was always going to have to double shield and farm down anyway, so all it's really doing is meaning that I take slightly less waterfall damage, but Xerneas would get this farm down regardless. So now Xerneas will be down a shield, but I have a charge attack loaded on Kyogre. I have so much energy stored on the Xerneas as well. So now I get to start unleashing this damage. Close combat bait gets the shield. I fire off the Moonblast. They catch onto the Reshiram, but realistically, it's just not going to matter. Moonblast takes the KO. I can just stay in, go for the snipe, and in comes Kyogre. The Avalanche is banked. We catch Zekrom in the middle of farming up. Avalanche takes the knockout. And even despite a pretty rough lead and 2 crunch debuffs, this team just keeps on cooking. We get a great lead in the next match. Kyogre into Xerneas. Xerneas is going to farm up a massive amount of energy and try for a catch onto Palkia. Unfortunately, I always like to let my opponent throw first there because they're going to end up reaching 100 before I do as the Kyogre player. So I'm very comfortable forcing them to throw, and then once they throw, then I can wait the turn and ensure that Origin Pulse is going to land and take the knockout or get a shield. My opponent actually shields in the mid game, and that's really, really nice for me because this matchup is so dominant for Xerneas. The Geomancies hit incredibly hard. They make it to another Aqua Tail, and I realize that I just simply don't care. I can go for energy on Kyurem White. So I send in Kyurem White, look at the Dragon Breath go, they pivot out, sending back in the Xerneas. My opponent did switch out with the back-to-back close combats, but Kyurem White just simply wins charge attack priority, so I can fire off the Fusion Flare, and now they're forced to give up their final shield or lose the energy. They decide to go shields down, and considering I have so much energy stored on Kyogre, I'm very comfortable with that. The Palkia has an Aqua Tail. It is never making it to a Spatial Rend. They've just simply taken way too much damage. I overfarm with Kyurem, fire off the Fusion Flare, down goes Xerneas, and in the back, my opponent has a non-Shadow Tyranitar, and that's about to get one-shot by Origin Pulse. Origin Pulse takes the knockout, in comes Palkia, and because they take such little damage from Waterfall, they're actually able to make a Spatial Rend. If they were going up against Dragon Breath, they wouldn't have made it, but even the Spatial Rend just simply not going to be enough to knock out Kyogre. Hopping into the final match with this team, Kyogre into Lunala. Let's see, will they throw on 7? They do throw on 7, and this is basically perfect. This is exactly what I'm hoping for, because Kyogre can always tank this. At this time, I do decide to switch it up and go for an Avalanche bait. I like to full send the Origin Pulse to guarantee huge damage to the knockout, but everyone was shielding, so I decide, you know what, I may as well bait. I send in Kyurem White, they respond with Reshiram, and this game's over. We know how dominant of a matchup this is. Iceburn picks up the one-hit KO, opponent sees the writing on the wall, and concedes the match. Well, we have reached the end of the battles, so now it's time to answer the question: why are top trainers flocking towards Kyurem White in the Master League? And well, after playing it, I think I have found some answers. Kyurem White's greater HP stat than the lesser dragons of Reshiram and Zekrom means that in the head-to-head matchups, Kyurem White is just able to absolutely bully those Pokemon. Kyurem White has pretty similar pacing to those lesser dragons, but its ability to win the head-to-head matchups mean that you're not having to deal with a mirror match where you're down energy. You can commit shields, farm something down, and then your energy will almost always go everywhere. So it's a very effective answer to a lot of the teams that are being used right now that heavily rely on the lesser dragons and heavily rely on Lunala. Additionally, I believe Kyurem White does extra Dragon Breath damage to Dialga compared to the other lesser dragons, which means that Kyurem White actually beats Dialga. I believe it beats Dialga's straight Fusion Flare. That is just absolutely absurd. Kyurem White has no business beating Dialga. Dialga isn't used particularly often, but the fact that it's just a winning matchup is just absolutely crazy. And because of the huge HP stat, it also does very, very well into some of the other dragons like the Palkias of the world. So after playing Kyurem White, I am so incredibly impressed with this Pokemon. I wasn't really a Kyurem White believer until I played it, and now I think I might be Kyurem White's strongest advocate. This Pokemon is insane. I have a 14 attack Kyurem White. So my Kyurem White is not even good PvP IVs. I would always lose charge attack priority if I put it on the lead. But as a safe switch, it's really hard to answer Kyurem White. Even something like a Xerneas or a Zacian, at the very least, you can hit for massive neutral to super effective damage. So I really feel like Kyurem White is a strong contender during this Master League week. If you're looking to climb, you could do a lot worse than putting Kyurem White on your team. This team as a whole has just been incredible for me, a monster win rate. And I basically got to a point where I ended up running out of opponents. The queue times got really bad, so the only reason I'm stopping playing this team is just because it's very difficult to find opponents rather than the team not working. The team is so strong, Kyurem White is so strong, and hey, I guess I know why everyone uses it now. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed watching today's video, please do help support the channel by leaving a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not. And an extra special thank you, as always, to our channel members here on YouTube. The support you guys provide to the channel is so appreciated. So thank you guys so very much. And until next time, I've been HomeSliceHenry.